morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's panel event. The Labour Party has today launched a report into its findings from its consultation over the summer on a green economic recovery. And so we're delighted to be joined today by Labour's Shadow Chancellor Anneliese Dodds and key business leaders from across the UK representing a diverse group of business leaders who are at the forefront of the drive towards a net zero economy. I'm Ailbhe Rea, I'm the political correspondent at the New Statesman. I'll be chairing this. So just to start off, I'll briefly introduce the panel. The structure will be, we'll have brief sort of 4 to 5 minute remarks from each of our panelists. With their main thoughts, all coming at this from different perspectives and directions, but their main thoughts on how we can have a green recovery from coronavirus. And then we'll also be hearing from Anneliese. And then for the second section, we'll be taking questions and answers. So you can submit a question to one panelist or to all our panelists using the Q&A function below. And I'll be fielding those as we go on. So feel free as the discussion goes on to submit those in the Q&A at the bottom. Just to briefly introduce our panel, firstly, we're very pleased to be joined by Ennis, the UK CEO of Siemens, by Jason Murphy, the Research Director at the AMRC, by Verity, Davidge, Director of Central Policy at MakeUK, Steve Waygood from Aviva Investors, Chris Richards from the Institute of Civil Engineers, and of course by Anneliese Dodds, the Shadow Chancellor. So Anneliese, can I start with you? We know that today you launched this report, which is urging the government, among other things, to bring forward a big package of capital investment to hopefully spur on 400,000 jobs within the next 18 months. But we also know that a comprehensive spending review is planned, is due to come out on the 25th of November. What will you be calling for in that spending review?
Well, thanks very much indeed, first of all, for being on this call, everyone, and thanks for that kind introduction. It's really great to be joined by so many business people who've been real leaders in this area. I think we wanted with this report really to be building on the tremendous expertise and ambition that there is in the UK around the green transition. We had almost 2,000 people responding to us. And the report, I would say, is just a start. It doesn't pick up on everything that came through that consultation, but just as was mentioned, we wanted it to start that conversation around particularly the capital element of the comprehensive spending review and the government's response to the National Infrastructure Commission and what it set out previously. We do think looking at the UK's announced stimulus so far, it is significantly below the value of the stimulus announced in other countries. We would argue that's particularly the case for some of the core technologies of the future, where we've had a lot of discussion in the past, very exciting discussion, but where we haven't necessarily moved forward at the speed that's necessary. We'd argue that's particularly the case when it comes to the use of green hydrogen, for example, and also carbon capture and storage. And the report indicates a number of ways in which we'd like to see government bringing forward investment in those areas, but in other aspects of the environmental recovery that's necessary as well, looking both at nature conservation and management, but also looking at the built environment, where we've seen some moves in the right direction, but where far more needs to be done, both to retrofit existing homes, but to ensure that we have higher quality homes for the future. And I have to say, I'm really excited. I feel that now is potentially a turning point. Obviously, we have Labour calling for this. Interesting that government also yesterday, the Chancellor promoting green bonds, something that we've been in favour of as well. Potentially the Prime Minister making a statement later on in the week as well. So I think it's really important that we make use of this opportunity and make sure the comprehensive spending review matches up to those ambitions.
And Anneliese, how do you see business and politicians working together on this?
Well, I think now is a very exciting time. I've been fascinated really by some of the announcements that have been coming out from industry over the last few months, not just in the UK, but internationally as well. We've seen a number of major companies, but also industry associations for smaller firms as well, really being very clear that they want to ensure that as we deal with the immediate crisis of coronavirus, that we're dealing with the environmental crisis as well. Obviously, we've known since the time of the Stern Review so many years ago that the ultimate largest challenge to our economic growth and stability is the climate one and the challenge of environmental degradation. So I think it's really important that we work together. And I've described this in terms of having higher expectations on both sides. Now, I think government needs to ensure that we have higher expectations of business that's going with the grain of what so many in business are already pushing towards. And we need to ensure that levers around procurement, around conditions on investment, and around provision of government support, that they're aligned with those net zero goals. But then I think on the other hand, business can and should have higher expectations of government, that there should be a much more stable regulatory context for the future, one that can be relied upon, that can enable the crowding in of private investments, that we should have the kind of public support for private investment that occurs in other countries with a national investment bank like we see in so many other nations, which could help to remove some of the risk from some of the changes that we need to see. That we really can have those higher expectations on both sides, and through that face up to that climate challenge as well as the economic challenge.
Thanks, Anneliese. We'll go to Carl Ennis, the UK CEO of Siemens next. From what you've just heard from the Shadow Chancellor, Carl, what are your thoughts on the public investment that you need to see from government to make a green recovery possible?
Yes, thanks, Ailbhe, and thanks to Anneliese for those comments. So just a little bit, very brief about Siemens. So we're an engineering and technology company focused on energy, industry and infrastructure. And whilst we are a German headquartered organisation, we have a strong UK presence. So we have 16,000 employees up and down the UK, heavily northern based. And we've been in the UK for 170 years. So yes, an international organisation with a footprint in Europe, but very, very local. And from our perspective, we believe that net carbon zero requires a couple of things to happen. First of all, for us to address some of the national challenges, and Anneliese talked about some of the things we've done as a country, so how we've addressed coal on our electricity systems and the announcements around removing the internal combustion engine, and also some of the bigger national challenges that we have. And Anneliese, you mentioned there about green hydrogen, which we would wholeheartedly support activity on, and carbon capture and storage. But it also requires us to look at a lot of embedded carbon emissions that are yet to be addressed. So what we do from a local energy system perspective, where we have a lot of reciprocating engines that are high emitters and poor efficiency CHP systems, what can we do about that? About the efficiencies and productivities in our industrial base, about how we address that. Green homes is a topic we've talked about, and also about our large estate of buildings, commercial and industrial buildings, how we make them intelligent, and rather than part of the problem, perhaps part of the solution. I think we know how to make these changes. One thing that makes me helps me sleep at night is we've some good example of that, and offshore wind, probably the best example of that, where Anneliese, you mentioned clear policy, clear and stable policy is fundamental for business. And somebody has to prime the pump of a new market. So that incentivization that happened by a national government. And the result of that is now a world-class market in delivering green, clean energy and good quality local jobs. So we know how to do this. I think from my perspective, one of the things is just the scale of the task and the ambition, and have we got that right? It was interesting to know in lockdown, emissions in our major cities, our NOx emissions reduced by 40%, our CO2 emissions by 20%. Now we could say that's fabulous, But if you imagine to get to net carbon zero, we almost crippled our country and we managed a 20% reduction in CO2. So that helps with the scale of the task. The UK Green Buildings Council have said that in order to clean up our homes, we need to start today doing 2 homes a minute to clean up and improve the efficiency in our housing stock. So just the scale of the task is what concerns us. And are we being, as a country, are we being bold enough? So Siemens have done some work with the UK 100, which is a group of local and ambitious government leaders to call for a net zero development bank to help prime that pump for these other markets. And we believe that doing that in a stable manner, focused locally on green solutions that will crowd in that private finance that we believe is there. We do not believe this is a technology challenge. That's hard for technologists to say. We will need technology to solve it, but it's not a challenge. The challenge is one of organisation and accepting that it's not just the big topics that we need to address, but a plethora of small topics. And that's where we have to look at local government with alongside in a national framework to address that, to address the overall picture of getting the country to net carbon zero.
And that net zero development bank that you're calling for is quite similar to Labour's call today for a national investment bank. You can see that you're kind of on the same page on that.
Absolutely, and we see that as a benefit. And the slight difference we would have is that it's for ours is, first of all, I haven't seen the detail of the suggestion, but we would welcome it. We would ask that it be focused locally and it be focused at the development phase of projects. What we see if in the offshore wind industry, actually private capital fundamentally funds the offshore wind industry. It required a step of faith to happen, which is perhaps where the net zero development bank is what we'd like to see.
I'll just bring in Jason Murphy from the AMRC at this point, just to come at this from a different angle. When we talk about paving the way for a green recovery, one of the the key things that we need to address is the skills gap. So can I just ask you, Jason, what your assessment is of the skills gap at the moment and what you would like to see from government or from the private sector in terms of plugging that skills gap, particularly among younger people and more disadvantaged people? Hang on, sorry, you're on mute, Jason.
Hi, yes, Jason Murphy from the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre in Wales. We're part of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult Network. There's some really exciting green large infrastructure projects that should be paving the way for the UK in the coming years. Carl talked about offshore wind technology and floating wind. There's some huge opportunities around SMRs and nuclear, and the big opportunities around hydrogen as well. Working here in Wales, we share a building with Airbus, and the aerospace industry and the automotive industry are going to take a big hit over the next 12 months and lose a lot of employees. I think Airbus just announced over 2,000 redundancies in the last 6 weeks. And that's a huge hit on the local economy here in Wales. But these are highly skilled individuals, and it's not going to take a lot to retrain these people for working in nuclear, for working in hydrogen, for working with offshore wind technologies. But I'd like to see more support from the UK government to identify the specific types of training that will be made available to these individuals to reskill them. And I think that's very important. And I heard on the radio this morning, I think it was Ed Miliband, and he was challenged, and it was said, well, there's a lot of people in retail who are going to be losing their jobs. How do we reskill those people in retail for working in nuclear or hydrogen or offshore wind. And it's a really good question, but we need to challenge ourselves to do that. And I think we all have it within ourselves to do whatever it is that we want to do, given the right motivation, the right support, the right incentives. And I just think we need some clear direction, some clear policies from the UK government on this.
Verity, Davidge from MakeUK, what skills are, just picking up on Jason's point, what skills in particular are manufacturers worried about? What are the skills in particular that we need to be addressing and filling the gaps in?
Yeah, thanks for just inviting me to today's panel, a really kind of topical and interesting debate. And actually MakeUK yesterday published our 3-point action plan, and it's great to see so many synergies between what we see for a recovery and that from Labour today. I mean, in terms of skills needs, I mean, it's almost that such broad brush approach, and what we actually need to do is start to look at those kind of jobs that we need now and in the future to meet the green agenda, and begin to map out those skill sets now. I think we see it again with the kind of digital skills side, that we are making huge advancements in digital technology, and then we find our education and skills system lagging behind somewhat, and we don't want to be in the same position here. I think there is, I was really pleased to see the call to action in today's paper on an emergency training programme in place. So MakeUK, together with the TUC, sector skills councils and other trade associations, have called on government to establish a national skills task force to both take those people who have unfortunately lost their jobs and to upskill and reskill them in the skill sets that we need. And of course, this agenda is one where it's all about job creation. So yes, we're unfortunately in the manufacturing industry, we've seen 50% of our members make redundancies, with up to 25% of those staff being lost. We really need to retain those in the sector and look at where there are growth opportunities, and clearly it is around this agenda. So I think there is that retraining and reskilling of existing staff, and then of course at the other end of the spectrum, and Jason have touched upon this, it's how we then bring the next generation with us. And I think we are at the greatest opportunity now, because just like how our next generation are digital natives, they are also really attuned to the sustainability agenda. So I have so many manufacturers that kind of bemoan the fact that young people aren't interested in our sector, and now we have this opportunity to showcase how we are digital and green. And I think that's a really attractive offer, that if we just begin to sell ourselves like this. I think there is obviously a role that government needs to play here. So business groups, including MakeUK, have been really concerned about the drop-off of apprenticeship numbers. So we saw 30% of companies put some or all of their apprenticeship training on hold during the pandemic. Now this has begun to ease as we've seen the lockdown ease, and then the education providers and training and colleges reopen. But if we look to the next 12 months, just 45% of manufacturers plan to recruit an apprentice. Now, this may seem high to other sectors, but this is a figure that has traditionally sat about 75%. So definitely the lowest figure that I've seen at my time at MakeUK. So we really want to get those numbers back on track, and I think begin to give employers that flexibility on how we spend our apprenticeship levy, even if it is more targeted approaches to the green agenda. And then really boosting technical education. You know, we talk about it a lot, but we need to do it. And if, say, T-levels are the way forward, it's really important that just during this crisis, we don't lose momentum of these really good opportunities. So again, unfortunately, it's the case that 85% of companies are saying they won't be offering such placements. But actually now is the time when we need to really be encouraging employers to offer more of those opportunities, because otherwise we'll be facing an even more acute skills shortage in the future.
Thanks, Verity. Steve Waygood from Aviva, can we go back to the point that we were touching on with Carl about the potential value of a national investment bank in the UK? What do you make of that idea? Do you see a place for that in terms of a wider green recovery plan?
Definitely, we're strong supporters. So I thought it was excellent that Anneliese in her introduction reminded us all about the Stern report, a world first back in 2006 that reminded us just how significant the economic impacts would be. The financial consequences to people's pension savings and investments would also clearly be phenomenal. At its worst model, we modeled out to 6 degrees by the end of the century, which is unlikely but plausible. That would erode at present prices 43 trillion from the global stock of capital. So this bank should be seen in not just as banking bankable projects right now and mobilizing money to where it's needed, but we need to effectively save capitalism from itself using capitalism. We need to reshape markets so that they are much, much longer term. Even the work of the Prudential Regulatory Authority today, looking as it does at the time horizon for stress tests, doesn't encourage us to look out to the end of the century. As a business, we've been around for 320 years, and we know it is beyond 2070 where the physical risks of climate change become so profound that the rights of future generations will be tested, as will the very structure of markets and civilization. That is where the science tells us we're heading. 3.8 degrees is the embedded global warming potential of the London Stock Exchange. So we need to reshape markets, not just with banks, but looking at listing rules, looking at governance codes, looking at stewardship codes, harnessing actuarial science, restructuring the way that discount cash flow works, rethinking modern portfolio theory, which is now old enough to have grandchildren. It is no longer olden. But we now need to think about all these interventions. Contemporary practical examples. We've heard from the FCA that it intends to make the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure Guidance mandatory on a comply or explain basis. I think that is welcome. We've been doing it now as Aviva for 4 years, but it needs to be put to the vote at the company AGMs so that the owners of the companies can hold the company to account for either its compliant report or the explanation for why it is missing. Without that oversight, the explanation can be really very poor. So that's one change. Secondly, we're very strong believers in net zero. We've made a commitment as a business to 2050. We've talked about our auto enrollment schemes as well, being the default scheme being net zero. We think that needs to be, the pensions bill provides an opportunity to make that standard practice. So it's great that DWP are talking about TCFD reporting for pensions, but what we really need is commitments to net zero. I'm on the task force, the TCFD, and I would acknowledge that a company can produce a perfectly compliant report which does not commit to transition towards the Paris Agreement. And we need to make sure with COP26 and the G7 next year, we take the opportunity to reshape markets so that it is a fact that they undergird rather than undermine the Paris Agreement, which is all too often a problem right now. And we're promoting what we consider to be an international platform for climate finance, so that we at COP26 can create a vision for finance, a series of plans for how we mobilize that, and then a process for how we hold it to account, which maps and mirrors the political agreements that we've seen in the Paris Agreement. At the moment, the financial plans are missing. Back to you.
Thanks, Steve. Chris Richards from the Institute of Civil Engineers, can I bring you in, tying together the kind of two strands of what we've been talking about? Firstly, on investment, how do you think we can ensure a steady stream of capital for green infrastructure? And then secondly, from the skills angle, how can we rapidly upskill workers to make that infrastructure?
Happy to take both those questions. I mean, just to kick off, a quick word on the Institution of Civil Engineers. So we exist to provide insights on infrastructure for societal benefit, using that expertise of our global membership. So we have about 95,000 members around the world. And what we do is look at that global level to identify some clear similarities across countries in terms of what the most effective policy frameworks need to be. And I'll use those lessons in terms of answering the two questions. So, I mean, on the first question around kind of private capital for green infrastructure, I think there are two key aspects when it comes to stable long-term capital for any infrastructure investment: certainty of the new investment pipeline and clear and transparent funding to then repay that private capital. We think both can be delivered through a net zero infrastructure plan that tackles some of the big political trade-offs needed to transition infrastructure to net zero. And I know that's something that Anneliese and the Labour Party have been talking about in terms of what we need to do going forward. We shouldn't forget as well that over 50% of UK infrastructure is privately owned. So that certainty in policy direction is actually quite important to ensure companies can actually move in the right direction very quickly. For us, a key plank that can be actioned imminently is the establishment of UK Investment Bank, which we've been talking about already, to replace the loss of access to finance provided previously by the European Investment Bank. Now, the EIB has provided finance to many infrastructure projects for several decades in the UK, and that's something that after the EU referendum in 2016, we recognised we needed to retain some kind of function around that. Some of the things we've seen it do is be a source of anchor investment, encouraging other private finance to act as a first mover on projects which might otherwise struggle to obtain any financing whatsoever. And within the context of new technologies associated with green infrastructure and delivering net zero, that I think is particularly important. With an explicit sustainability mandate as well, the bank could seek out some net zero aligned projects, and it would invest in projects that demonstrate good value, i.e. socioeconomic, environmental or regional development benefits, not just economic or commercial considerations. So I think that's quite important. And it ultimately kind of affect that market failure and facilitate the movement of capital at scale towards net zero. And I think a potential first role for the bank could be to support that post-pandemic economic recovery through investment in net zero infrastructure going forward and crowding in that private investment and finance that we've seen it do for decades in the UK. I mean, touching briefly on the skills angle and how can we kind of rapidly upskill the workforce to accelerate progress on green infrastructure projects. I mean, I think one of the key aspects here is that lifelong learning and skills development will obviously be essential and will be necessary to kind of deliver an infrastructure projects going forward. And we need to see a detailed skills plan for a net zero workforce that will prove especially valuable in the context of COVID-19 recovery. You know, the economic downturn has obviously resulted in high levels of unemployment, which we've been hearing about today, and longer term structural shifts in terms of the labour market are likely as we make that transition to a new normal following the pandemic. I think in response to the pandemic, workforces may need to reskill and retrain for a new greener economy, and there's a real good opportunity here for us to kind of double down on that opportunity. Within that context, the infrastructure skills plan should identify current skills gaps, emerging skills requirements, barriers to upskilling and retraining, and education, training and skills requirements, as well as foster a more diverse and inclusive workforce. And I think often we talk about skills plans and the work within the skills landscape, and we forget that actually we have been here before. So, you know, during the coalition years, we did see a skills plan developed as part of the National Infrastructure Plan for Skills. And so that's a unique opportunity to build on that work that was done previously to identify, okay, what are the new skills we're going to require as we look towards 2050 and look towards 2050 with the kind of pace that's required in the next few years.
Thanks, Chris. We're going to move on to questions shortly. So a reminder to those watching that you can ask questions in the Q&A box down below. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question so far. But before we move on to that, Anneliese, would you like to summarise your kind of key thoughts off the back of this discussion so far?
Goodness me, well, so much has come out of the different contributions. It'll be hard to try and summarise them, but I would say I think it's really interesting how much agreement there is, I think, across sectors and across disciplines, and again, between business and politics around this. I think, first of all, clearly we've just been having that discussion around skills, and, you know, there are short-term challenges here. I think there's no question about that, especially in many areas where we have a lack of capacity. You know, completely recognise what was mentioned around apprenticeships by Verity. We've had a lot of change in further education over recent years as well, and reduction in capacity. We need to be facing up to that very quickly. We would argue that that needs to be driven by a response rooted in existing institutions, so not having always a top-down approach to this, really working with colleges, LEPs, local authorities to try and ensure that the reskilling that's provided is appropriate and locally rooted. I very much agree with what was said around the finance agenda as well. I think there's been so much ambition over recent years, and politics has kind of not caught up a lot of the time. We really need to do so, and urgently, so that we're going with a grain of developments. And then just very quickly, finally, very strongly agree with what was said about different sectors and the need for what's sometimes been described as a just transition. We set out in the report different ways in which the unemployment and jobs crisis that's occurring in a number of different sectors that are particularly hard hit by the pandemic could be tackled through a much more strenuous, engaged approach, we believe, from central government, but also from metro mayors and local authorities as well. We've seen the impact, the positive impact of what I would call industrial coordination during this crisis, the ventilator challenge, with so many other aspects of what's had to happen in, at speed. We need to adopt a similar approach when it comes to facing up to some of these big jobs and skills challenges in different sectors. So hopefully people will see material in the report that matches up to some of those concerns.
Thanks, Anneliese. So keep sending in your questions in the Q&A box. And also panelists, if you'd like to jump in when someone else is answering a question, just raise your hand and you can chip in, because I know it's hard to do that when we're virtual, but feel free to do so. The first question to Anneliese again, one of the broader themes, not just in terms of a green economic recovery, but a big theme throughout our discussion of this pandemic has been a criticism of an approach that's too centralised. And one of the recurring arguments has been that local government has shown that it's better adapted to local needs. How do you see local government playing a role in terms of a green recovery?
And I think it's absolutely essential. I mean, I just touched on it in the context of some of the skills challenges, but I think local authorities and where they exist, there's more regional organisations as well, the mayoral authorities, but also, of course, the devolved administrations and devolved governments, albeit at a much greater scale. They're incredibly important, I think, to achieving the coordination that's going to be necessary for that transition. Just one kind of counter example, I suppose, and kind of the opposite of what I think should be happening. So all of us MPs, and sorry, some people on this call have heard me say this before, but we've been asked to submit proposals for which railway lines we want to see reopen. So us individual MPs troop into the Department of Transport and try and persuade ministers around that. That is not the way to produce a joined up low carbon transport infrastructure. It really should be driven by local plans, which are regionally joined up. That's the way to make them effective and durable. I would say it's also the way a lot of the time, and this does relate to procurement and other factors, but it's the way to ensure that they have positive local employment impact as well. And I think it's also the way, just related to something Chris said, which I think is really critical, it's the way to ensure that we actually have that longer term pipeline of projects coming through when we're looking at some of the harder infrastructure side, so that people can start to see these kind of areas as really providing a potential career for themselves for the next 25 years. So I think it's win-win on all fronts, really.
And a question for Jason. What role should public procurement play in helping to make markets and to ensure high standards and best practice are rewarded? Oh, hang on, you're on mute.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. Public procurement need the supply chain, and for a lot of what's going to be necessary for these large green infrastructure projects going forward, the supply chain just isn't there. So there's going to be a lot of work for organisations to develop that supply chain, and here I think public procurement has a big role to play in setting initiatives out for developing the supply chain in the first instance.
If I can just do the jump on in, wave my hand on that. And we've, in terms of public procurement, we recently surveyed members on this, and 90% of companies said that they were dissatisfied about their ability to win public procurement contracts in their region. And I just think that figure is just pretty outstanding. And And I think actually in terms of net zero, we probably need to explore whether we need to start incorporating net zero considerations into those procurement opportunities.
And the next question is also for you, Verity. How should we look to ensure that transport and transport development contributes to a green recovery with, for example, the questioner asks, on a rolling electrification programme for railways?
I think that from what we're seeing, so many companies now want government to be focusing infrastructure on kind of the green agenda. So just to check my statistic, 45% of manufacturers say that infrastructure projects focusing on green energy should be prioritised to support UK manufacturing. And when deciding what infrastructure the country should invest in, 27% of companies said ensuring infrastructure is both green and sustainable. So I think it is really actually, and back to this regional agenda, we see such a split actually when we look at Midlands, North and South about those needs, but actually focusing on those infrastructure projects that are green and sustainable is really where we need to be for this new recovery.
Can I jump in on that one as well, just to kind of reinforce something I was saying earlier as well. And I think the question was asking around, give us some examples of things like rolling electrification for rail. I mean, if you look at the history of that, and the reason why in the last rail investment strategy that failed, is because we didn't have that long-term kind of supply chain attached to that. So we thought we'd go ahead and kind of electrify railways in the UK, and we quickly discovered that we don't have the supply chain, we don't have the skills, because we hadn't done it for such a long period of time. And so this is what I was saying around having that long-term net zero infrastructure plan to actually look at how do you transition all of infrastructure and give that certainty around the direction of policy travel, so that people can start to make decisions around skills, but also around investment and also around capital investment as well.
I also have a supplementary question on the same theme for you, Anneliese. So we've heard a lot of noises from government about improving roads and infrastructure and a big amount of investment in that. The question is, how will you work with the Shadow Transport team to make sure that on the Labour side your plans are joined up?
Yeah, I mean, we have been working very closely together. In fact, funny enough, I was just having a chat with our Shadow Transport Secretary, there you go, genuinely, this morning on exactly these subjects, and they were involved in producing this report. I mean, we're very clear that we need to have a transport strategy that works for the long term. And actually, it's critically important that we face up to many of these challenges and don't bake in additional carbon when we have the chance to ensure that we actually can drive down emissions. And actually, it's quite interesting in relation to the previous discussion around rail electrification. I think it's very, very important that government ensures that the right structures are in place so that we can actually drive that change financially as well. So that means, for example, having a green book within the Treasury. I know there's been some changes, but a green book which actually fosters that much longer term view, and where there may be those kind of short to medium term challenges around new green technologies, that we overcome them at pace, learning from developments in other countries. And I think that's particularly important in transport. And, we know that's one of the core sectors where we've got to decarbonise. It's been quite positive developments when it comes to energy, particularly offshore wind. But the big challenges now, transport, built environment and heating. And that does mean having that longer term perspective.
Thanks, Anneliese. A question for Carl. The Committee for Climate Change has said it will not be possible to get close to meeting a net zero target without engaging with people or by pursuing an approach that focuses only on supply side changes. So how do we engage communities and ensure buy-in on the consumer side?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with that. Demand side is always the challenge. There's some really good old examples for those of us old enough to remember, and it's actually still around and we don't talk about it. Economy 7, you could almost give away electricity, but because it actually meant that you had to, because of technology at the time, wake up in the middle of the night to switch your dryer on, it wasn't really adopted. So actually, it's how do we make people aware of this, but also how can we deploy technology, smart technology in people's homes and in businesses and in factories to actually get the benefits of that whilst minimizing the impact on individuals. And back to one of the earlier comments around local, that this is where local is really, really important, and local authorities have a huge role to play in that. They are well positioned. But Anneliese, you talked about coordination. Our experience as a commercial organisation trying to work with local cities and local authorities is that actually that is not yet quite as easy as it could be, and that prohibits commercial organisations going in and really making sort of step changes. But absolute adoption is absolutely fundamental. But you have to make it easy, and that's where smart technology can really help with that.
I can see that Steve and Chris would both like to come in on that. So Steve first.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chris, as well. I think it was Duncan Law who asked the question that you just gave to Carl. It's a great question. He talks about needing the consent and participation of the people. Now, there's a really interesting campaign that was launched 4 or 5 months ago by Richard Curtis called Make My Money Matter. Now, that's a civil society campaign aimed at UK pensioners, encouraging them to think about what they're financing, which is all about what we're talking about here, whether it's built infrastructure, greening that, whether it's greener transport, whether it's better energy systems that are based on renewable, and so on and so on. But it is absolutely the case that it's people's pension savings and investments that finance the economic activity today, and how that gets invested will shape the economy of tomorrow. And it used to be the case in 1802 that those people would go into the stock market, go into the exchange itself with cash and walk out with share certificates. They knew what they owned. It would be an opportunity for them to vote at the AGM. Now, over the last few hundred years, we've disenfranchised the end investor. And I bet hardly anyone listening to this call has any idea where their money is today. And even if they do, they probably have no clue how their vote was used at company AGMs. Now, Make My Money Matter is trying to correct that, and I think it's a brilliant campaign. I'd like to imagine a future, and this could actually be required. Government needs to actually require this, where every pensioner can see, whether or not they choose to is another matter, but they should be able to see what's in their portfolio, how is their vote used, and shape their votes going forwards. Otherwise, we don't live in a shareholder democracy. And if you put the TCFD report to the vote, then they can start to vote on a just transition as well. Because of course, human rights and the rights of future generations, individuals, communities, and households also need to be considered. And that if you equip the people, that they literally will have consent and they will literally be able to participate. We need to rethink markets, as I was saying at the beginning, and that's how you do it with pensions.
Thanks, Steve. And we are starting to see that a bit with pension plans starting to offer a green pension plan, because I have one. But Chris, can I bring you in on that? I know that you wanted to add something.
Yeah, and I think the question is spot on in terms of, how do we focus here on some of the demand side things as well, not just supply side. So in our State of the Nation report that we published back in July, we looked at some of the things that the public could be doing as well. And I think this is really where local authorities and kind of subnational bodies could really be making a difference in looking at how do you drive behavioral change through either new infrastructure or the way infrastructure is currently used. And some of the interesting stats that came out from a survey we did, looking at if the public, the average person was to live car free, that's the equivalent of 2 tons of CO2 equivalent reduction a year from that person, which is considerable when you consider how much we need to reduce across the UK as a whole. So little things like that, where you look at, cycling and walking opportunities, how do we invest in that going forward and making sure that kind of behavioral change happens. I was struck by something that I came across years ago in terms of the City of York and the work that they were doing to encourage people to start using buses. One of the things they focused on was encouraging park and ride facilities, so that people didn't see buses as a negative thing to be doing, but actually something that's still linked to car use, and over time, gradually moving the population away from cars towards seeing buses as a viable alternative. So it's ideas like that, I think, where local authorities could really be making a difference at how do you actually drive that behavioural change at the local level and then get that massive step change you need at the personal level.
And giving people the sort of the nudge in terms of their preconceptions around certain things.
Exactly.
Steve, I have another question for you. What are your views on regulatory measures to embed net zero targets within corporate governance frameworks, such as changes to the Companies Act?
They need to be very carefully structured, but I'm a supporter. And if you change the Companies Act to require companies to put their TCFD report to the vote at an AGM, which is one of the ways that you could do that, that report could include within it net zero targets. And if individuals don't see those targets, they could vote against the report. So that company law, section 172 of the Directors Act, is already very clear that we have a duty to present and future shareholders. That's great. We need to now make that the case. I was saying earlier, that it's towards the end of the century where we are worried from an existential perspective about the insurance sector's business model collapsing. We have a fiduciary duty to our shareholders and our clients to do what we can to restructure markets accordingly. So very strong supporter, as long as it's created carefully. There's also a question from Chris Ramsey about Solvency II and how we change that. It's quite arcane, so just to make it clear, it's the way insurance companies are regulated. We have to keep capital back if we're going to invest in infrastructure projects that are higher risk. It encourages us to invest in old economy fossil fuels and energy intensive businesses because they're considered oddly lower risk, and discourages us from investing in infrastructure businesses that are part of the solution because of the way they've come to the market. So I think we need to focus a climate lens on prudential regulation, which is what Solvency II is, and make sure that we allow the insurance sector to deploy its capital in the way it needs to secure its own future. It is deeply imprudent to encourage the insurance sector to invest in old economy fossil fuel businesses. And yet that's exactly what happens at the moment with Solvency II, and the Association of British Insurers has done excellent work in that space, and it needs to be done. It needs to be reconsidered. Of course, the Treasury has just opened a consultation on that. Back to you.
And so, Steve, if I can just add, as a technologist in this area, I'm bound to argue that actually the technology to do the right thing is often no riskier than it's just the business models for the old way are better understood. So, and it's actually not technology that makes it look, and so it's back to this, how do you evaluate risk? What is the perception of risk? We need to change that. It's not just about technology.
Thanks, Carl. I have another question for Chris and Anneliese, but other panelists do feel free to chip in if you'd like. The questioner asks, what can businesses and the opposition do to bring pressure to bear on the government on green infrastructure investment, particularly with linked EU funding disappearing? Anneliese, would you like to take that first?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there has been quite a lot of, activism, I suppose, from business, but from civil society as well in this area, which has been very productive. And we have seen some shifts. I mean, just this week, we saw yesterday the Chancellor announcing that government would be moving ahead with green gilts. We've had some intimations that the Prime Minister may be making some announcements around green infrastructure as well. I think it's very important that the public debate is focused around what has been achieved so far and exactly what is being promised. I mean, actually, what was announced just before the summer, quite a lot of it was pre-announced, for example. So I think it's really important that there is that understanding, really, of where we genuinely are moving forward as opposed to where we're still on the same trajectory. I think some of the international comparisons have been very, very helpful here, and they have indicated areas where we do need to see much faster action. So yeah, I think there are opportunities for the future, but there are dangers as well. And actually, we've seen, I would argue, around some of the changes, particularly in aerospace, where we've seen, particularly France, but to an extent Germany as well, putting major investment in to shift to greener aerospace. We've not had that in the UK, and we've had quite a major impact on employment, unfortunately. So we do need to see much more rapid engagement with these issues by government.
Chris, can I bring you in on that? I mean, we hear kind of the right noises from government in terms of green jobs and a green recovery, but I think, as Anneliese was touching on, it's in the detail where the differences are and where the international comparisons shine through. What role can businesses play in actually holding the government's feet to the fire on delivering on those intentions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I mean, the first thing to say is this is obviously quite a complicated issue. You know, the UK alone isn't grappling with this. We're trying to do something at pace. You know, the net zero target is 2050, but we need to have made progress in the next 5 to 10 years to really actually nail that target. So there's a lot that we need to do in a very, very short period of time in the midst of a pandemic, which, you know, no one saw coming this time last year. I guess the main thing to flag in terms of what businesses could be doing to engage with government and get them to get the need for this transition. I think they get the need for the transition. The key thing is just setting out what are the questions that need to be answered as part of any future government policy. And that's what we did. We published a net zero infrastructure plan policy paper back in September, which outlined the kind of key challenges that needed to be addressed around how do we decarbonize transport, how do we decarbonize buildings and heat, how do we transition the energy system, and what do we do for those harder to abate sectors where actually we'll need some kind of technology solution, but we'll never get to net zero in those sectors. So it's really getting people to realize, getting government to realize that those are the big questions that need to be answered. And once we have those answers, then I think businesses can just get on and deliver as they've done before. So I think if there's anything to focus on, it's definitely at that level.
I think there's also, sorry, just before we go on to the next question, about how we also just encourage businesses to invest in green technologies. So we have Carl, Siemens doing great work, and we see kind of real world leaders of doing great stuff. But for the majority of our members who are smaller businesses, you know, at the moment you are tackling mitigating the impacts of COVID-19, which has actually even taken up all of the bandwidth of what would otherwise have been preparing for the end of the transition period. So when it comes to then preparing for net zero, there just seems like there's still not a lot of support and information out there for small businesses. And I think that the other thing we need to do, and the policy levers that we can pull, are how to incentivize companies of all sizes to invest in green technologies, such as using investment allowances, and also to remove the disincentives to investing in green technology. So if a company does put solar panels up on their site, that then they're not then faced with a bigger business rates bill. So I think there are actually a lot of things that government can do now and in the immediate term that would really encourage companies to invest in green technology. And it's kind of a question of why are we waiting around to make this happen?
Thanks, Verity. And that brings us on quite neatly to our next question, which I'm going to put to Carl, but again, everyone feel free to chip in if you'd like to. What role should mobile technology such as 5G play in the drive to net zero, do you think?
So I think that leads to the topic of data, and data at volume can equal noise if you're not careful. So it's how do you take that data and make sense of that volume of data. So 5G is absolutely crucial to be able to get the volume of data together, to be able to synthesize that data and make new learnings from that data. And we can use those new learnings to come up with new business models, with new indicators as what we should or shouldn't be doing. So the topic of data and digitalization is important. 5G is a fundamental step to be able to get the data at the scale that we need it to make those learnings, and that applies across all industries. You know, it is one of the national topics as opposed to a local topic, but it can have local impact. I mean, and if I can just sort of touch on a little bit about the skill sets, because that's also relevant there. People earlier we were talking about what skills do you need for the future, and if only I had that crystal ball, that would be brilliant. Because we immediately talk about data scientists or artificial intelligence experts. I worry a little bit about that, because we talk in the skills challenge as though it's from A to B, and I think we need to stop talking like that. It's actually, because once you get to B, C will be very close behind it, and D even faster. So that's what we've learned from the industrial revolutions, is the time between each one gets shorter and shorter. So yes, we can talk about data scientists now and the importance, but from a skills perspective, we should be also talking about the skills that we need to learn as individuals to accept and embrace change, because we know that when we move from here to the next space, that's not the finished article, and so that's terribly important as well.
So we're coming to, yeah, Anneliese, so we're coming to the end, so I'll bring Anneliese in, and then we have a final question for Jason. I'm not going to ask the panelists for concluding remarks because I feel like that often just involves repeating what you've already said. But if there are any sort of burning thoughts that you'd like to add that we haven't covered, just feel free after Jason's question. But Anneliese, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, sure, very cheekily. Sorry about this. Just really quickly on a couple of points. I really strongly agree with what Carl said there. First of all, we have said in the report, and it's absolutely fundamental, that we've got to link up digital infrastructure with green infrastructure, but we've also got to recognise, of course, many of the social justice challenges here. We've only had an hour, so we haven't been able to get into many of those, but I'm always struck by the example from my own community. I live on a council estate in Oxford, and we had a really remarkable, groundbreaking, decentralised energy project that operated on my estate that's still operating. It was a tremendous success, but it relied on smart technology for the distributed batteries in people's homes and the solar power that was involved. And actually, many people just simply do not have the means currently to provide that kind of connectivity for themselves. And when they had to go, kind of dial in and that kind of thing to achieve the connection, it just meant the project didn't work. So I think we need to start from where people are in relation to that. And I just end by saying as well, when we talk about skills, I think it's really important that we don't just have that image of the person in the hard hat really delivering these kind of green outcomes. Actually, when we look at some of the most labour intensive occupations, social care, for example, they are green jobs as well. They're ones where we need to push up productivity, and they're going to be very important for our economic recovery, as well as some of those that we'd think of as more fitting into the typical green job category.
And on that regional point, Jason, we had a question: what role should regional economic policymakers play? And is there a role for regional infrastructure banks or regional finance institutions?
Yeah, I absolutely think that there is. I could just give you an example from what's happening in Wales. Just as a small nation, for Wales to become number 3 in the world in terms of that's absolutely huge, and that's all because of decisions that have been made at regional levels, and I think that we should take that example of how a small nation like Wales has come to become a world leader in recycling as a good example to end the meeting on.
Thanks very much, Jason. So if anyone has any final comments that they would like to add, feel free to chip in. Otherwise, it just sort of remains for me to say thank you to all of our panelists for joining us. Carl Ennis, Jason Murphy, Verity, Davidge, Chris Richards, Stephen Waygood, and Anneliese Dodds. And thank you to everyone who's watched and for sending in your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.